Hi, my name is Sharon McIntosh. I am the Water and Energy Policy Advisor here at Queensland Farmers Federation, and my primary role is to advocate for farmers and ensure they can remain sustainable and viable in their business. I would say that one of the greatest challenges faced by farmers is navigating tariffs, for the most part, that actually don't actually suit the seasonal use of the agricultural industry. One of the other issues that they are having is the energy-water nexus, which energy producers don't acknowledge. We've been struggling with that for years. And obviously, especially irrigators who heavily use water require pumping to get their water on farm. So it's still an issue that there's no tariffs that really fully adequately incorporate the water energy nexus. So that those two issues are primary concerns for all of our members.
Can you speak a little bit more to the water energy nexus in particular?
Okay, so basically, the two are intricately related on farming, because obviously water is required to produce our crops, and then in most part the energy needed to produce the crops is required for pumping use. And in cotton, we've got cotton ginning, which is a heavy user of energy. So it can vary, and those tariffs don't adequately incorporate those two things in it, because different farming is different. I mean, obviously it's quite different in different areas depending on what you're growing. So that is also an issue, especially when we've got farming that may unfortunately go over the 100 megawatt for only a day or two. But unfortunately, that actually puts them into another category, and compounded with their water charges, that can really minimise their economics on their farm and what they get back.
Yep. What are your thoughts on the 100 megawatt hour limit? Is that something which is appropriate, or is that something which should be raised?
Yes, it's actually something that's not appropriate, because farming doesn't work that way. It's not everyone fits into one little pigeonhole. QFF have actually been advocating for a higher threshold for small users for quite some time. Unfortunately, we haven't actually achieved that. There will be some ministerial intervention that's required in order for us to get anywhere with that, but we're still pushing forward, because unfortunately that's the only way that we can reduce some of these pricing issues when it comes to the water energy nexus. Opportunities? I think the fact that they're actually looking at pilot programs for microgrids is a fantastic opportunity. If it comes to fruition, I think that will be great, and the fact that the state are actually looking at that, which will help farmers, and also the solar options, solar on farm options to help minimise energy costs and pumping costs is a fantastic opportunity.
So looking at the QCA document, a key intention of the current tariff reform is to almost channel behaviour in certain directions through like price points to accommodate future market trends like EV adoption and duck curve and stuff. Do you think the current market trends, and hence the current tariff setting, is at odds with the realities of agricultural production, and how so?
I think they're not really looking at how agricultural production is done, and it is made streamlined to what is suitable for the grid and the network. And as we've seen recently, a lot of those things just don't work. And if you're looking at agriculture, which I guess in the space of things there's not a large volume of them for the use of what you're talking about, but I don't think they're adequately being looked at.
Is the practice of using policy to shape farmers' load signatures to cater for market trends appropriate, or how should farmers' needs and practices be more incorporated in tariff setting?
I think the bottom line is that we've encountered is education. We really need more education from everyone, and it helps us, obviously reset policy, help advocate for change in policy, because a lot of the issues that we've seen is there's not enough education behind how those tariff pieces work and what the impacts will be to farmers if they're changed in any way. I mean, we see that the tariff structures and the different demand loads are changed quite regularly through the QCA, but I don't think the QCA also have an understanding of how farmers are utilising energy on farm, and then again it's a circle where farmers don't understand the education piece. Well, not all farmers. There's quite some tech savvy farmers that are utilising every piece of technology available that are really doing well on farms in regards to pricing, and obviously everything's becoming a little bit more affordable for them on farms, but it's the ones that don't understand that connection between the policy changes and what that means. I think we really need to really focus on.
Which is the most important education piece? Is it education to farmers about how tariff setting works, or is it more important education to QCA about how farming works?
I think it's the QCA. Because they are very structured in the delegation that they receive from the minister, and if there's anything outside their scope, they won't look at it. And I believe there needs to be more scope to look at impacts to agriculture, and it really needs to come from that end. I think a lot of, obviously we still need education with all the farmers, but it's the top end that don't fully understand how farming works and when those uses are required, especially seasonal use tariffs. I just think that that's where we really need to look at in order to change policy. Farmers are actually more prepared, I think, than most people are giving them credit for. QFF have been working with our members and their farmers for a good part of this year, in line with the state energy plan and the transition to renewables. So we're actually in the process of factoring our own policy changes that incorporate the transition to renewables. So our members are quite ready for that transition, but again, it's an education piece that we're currently working with the state government and Energy Queensland to incorporate those changes and what those changes will mean on farm. So I think they're more than ready. It's just, how are those changes going to impact? What is the grid going to look like? Does that mean there'll be more flexible options for them on farm for their water irrigation, or whether it's for cotton ginning, which obviously are a huge expense on the energy market? And I think the state government, and I think also the federal government, need to understand that farmers are way more ahead than I would say most people are in preparing for those changes, because obviously food and water security is paramount for all of us. What shape or form should that education take? So you've spoken about education in a couple of different contexts, but with this one, the transition to renewables, what shape or form should that take? Well, we're currently looking at every single renewable option, whether that's microgrids, solar on farm. There's various options that I'm actually working with here with the energy team and microgrids. So it's basically hoping that we can get more on-farm self-sufficient grids happening rather than being grid dependent on the open network. So if we can have that education piece fulfilled with our farmers here, then that will make it easier when we are looking at transitioning to renewables at the policy level.
Most resources attract a bulk discount if you're purchasing bulk. Electricity is almost the opposite. So, for instance, tariff 22B, you face supply charge increases the more you use, despite the per kilowatt hour charge remaining the same. And most large customer supply charges are up to 20 times that of small customer tariffs without greatly reduced per kilowatt hour charges. So is this lack of a bulk discount appropriate, or does the situation require policy intervention?
We don't believe this is appropriate, and therefore goes back to my original statement regarding having agricultural specific tariffs that suit the seasonal use of farming. We have been advocating for the flexibility of seasonal use tariffs for agriculture for some time, as there is still a lack of understanding how different farmers operate their businesses, and unfortunately not all can change to suit the strict guidelines of the tariff structures. Policy intervention is definitely an option, which will help relieve some pressure on our farmers, whilst also giving them the flexibility they need to manage the farms that not only ensure productivity but long-term economic viability.
What could some of those policy interventions look like?
I think actually giving them a lot more flexibility to integrate renewables into the grid. That would, I think, be a fantastic option. But obviously we've got strict regulations that inhibit that at the moment. I'm hoping, and I think over the next 6 to 12 months, you'll probably see a lot of change, and a lot of people agreeing that needs to be incorporated into policy changes in order to give farmers that flexibility. I think it has been a problem. I'm not sure if it's currently a large problem because obviously diesel prices have increased as well. I have seen and spoken to farmers that have been doing this. Unfortunately, the pricing has gone up in all cases now, so I think that sort of negates it. But the majority of farmers that we do speak to when we go out field have actually put in a lot more efficiency use options on farm to reduce their water losses and requirements for water. So I think that is an education piece that still needs to be looked at to have farmers, so some of these farmers that are using diesel still understand that relationship between what the diesel costs, the energy, but also using alternative energy options, which is what the UQ-QFF Energy Savers team do, but also water efficiency, because there's been dramatic reductions in pricing costs on farm for many of our farmers that have put in water efficiency measures in place. So I think some of these that you may have spoken to may need more water efficiency options to help them navigate those costs, but also looking at other alternative storage options and solar to pump. So especially some of those ones that I've spoken to out in the cotton region, they've got various cost savers in place, and obviously again it is dependent on what you're growing, what time of the year you're cropping, but I definitely think there's still more education to help some of those farmers minimise those costs to not utilise diesel, because I do know that was a problem, but I haven't heard it be such a problem in the last 6 to 12 months.
Right, okay. For flood irrigators in particular, who seem the most disadvantaged from the current tariff suite, because they can't, if you need to pump whenever the river's going, you need to pump 24/7. It's not negotiable. You're running high capacity pumps, so you cop a demand charge. You can't afford to have the load turned off, so you can't utilise the controlled load. You can't really put on solar because you don't get much of a feed in. And it might be on a NIMI that's only used for 4 days a year, for instance. What would be your advice to that particular suite of farmers who seem particularly disadvantaged?
I guess it depends what they're growing. I know there's some flood irrigators that have contained some of the water more so back in the channels to keep that without having to pump directly out of the river, because obviously it's height dependent as well, which we know is an issue in some areas. So I think some of the ones that I've seen, well, not too many, but there has been some that I've seen that have incorporated their own channels outside their farm or line channels to keep that water inside and then pumping it from there. But again, I don't think it's something that everyone, and I think every single circumstance needs to be identified and look at the opportunities that we could do to help reduce that. But I'm not saying that everyone possibly has an answer right now, which is why we need to have more policy intervention and educate the QCA state government on what the issues are there in farming, because you're right, they can't just switch things on and off depending on the timing that suits the tariff structure. It has to be what suits their farm. And then if you do have a crop that you've put in, you can't afford to not irrigate it. And that's just, especially in summer, I mean, you could lose virtually a whole crop. So unfortunately, those costs are still relatively high for those farmers, and they really need to be thoroughly investigated and to help those farmers stay viable and be able to continue to produce. But because without that, they will obviously have to shut their doors, and we don't want to see a decline in farming. QFF's key energy priorities currently are pricing to ensure affordability for all farmers so they remain viable and can also grow their farms without affordable energy. It's very hard for any farmers to continue expanding their crops, but they need, obviously with the rising water costs, rising energy costs, I mean, that's one of the only options they have is to grow their farms. When they're caught with the increase in pricing, it makes it very difficult. One of the other priorities is to obviously increase the 100-watt threshold, and we will continue to advocate for that because it does impact a lot of farmers quite significantly once they go over that threshold. So we're continuing to push to increase that. Also, in regards back to pricing, we want to remain at 16 cents across the board, so 8 cents for R, 8 cents for N. That's how we'd like to have it as a flat option. I mean, there is a tariff out that's very close to that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for all farmers. So we'd like to see something that's a little bit more affordable across the board for agricultural tariffs or specific tariffs for the agricultural sector. We've also want to ensure that the solar subsidy rebate gets removed from pricing, because that's something that we don't believe is a price component that should be part of the pricing structure. And we're also concerned where the EV is going to go. I mean, obviously the state government's looking at that within the next 6 months. That's a priority to see what that will look like and how that will impact the grid, because we're obviously concerned that will that make the grid unstable in certain locations. What does this mean for other tariffs, and will other tariffs be removed to accommodate, and how will that impact the agricultural sector? So there is quite a few things that are key issues, policy issues for us currently. And on top of that, obviously, we're preparing for the transition to renewables and what that looks like on grid and farm for our farmers. So there's quite a lot going on in the energy space at the moment. And obviously our key priority is to keep all our farmers up to date and informed as these changes happen, and also that they're ahead of the game once these changes happen completely.
To unpack that a bit, when you're talking about the just problem of energy pricing, is it energy pricing across the board, or are there specific components of pricing that are particular pinch points? Like say, is it just increased per kilowatt hour, or is it increased supply charges, or is it increased demand charges as well? Or are there like kind of specific tariffs that are problematic, or is it just the energy across the board increasing?
Energy across the board has increased. I think the underlying issue is that there's a lack of transparency in the pricing structure, which needs to come out. Without that, we can't really fully navigate how tariffs need to be priced going forward without that transparency. We have a lot more transparency in water pricing. I do understand the complexities behind energy and how that's related to the wholesale energy market, but the regulators behind this can factor in those charges well ahead of time, and that's something that our irrigators and all our farmers need. They need that surety of what that pricing may look like without having excessive price increases without justification of what those pricing components are that are setting those price increases. So I think more transparency. We need to look at pricing for all demand, everything. So it is across the board. It's not just one particular tariff. Some are more than others, but I guess from our end, we see that as something that the energy retailers have done to spread the load across the grid, but that doesn't necessarily help our farmers.
So it's transparency about the underlying drivers of price increases.
Yes, yeah, we really need transparency of how they're utilising the price increases, because the economics behind it are not aligning to what those pricing increases are. So there needs to be a lot more transparency put into that, because in order to change policy, we're not going to be able to do that without the full transparency of those actions.
The irrigation tariff, so tariff 62, 65 and 66, doesn't matter about the details of them, but basically they were all tariffs that were called irrigation tariffs because they used to make it attractive to water at night with cheaper electricity at night. Now there's no real incentive to water at night under tariff 20, which is kind of the closest comparable tariff. Tariff 20 is just the anytime tariff. Should farmers be incentivised to water at night?
Yes. However, that's not farming. Unfortunately, when there's a lot of crops putting in, at seed stage, those crops need to be watered during the day or they'll die. So there's some crops that just cannot be watered solely at night from day dot. So no, unfortunately.
Do you think that it's a good thing then to remove those irrigation tariffs that used to give you cheaper off-peak use? No,
there was a lot of sentiment to keep those tariffs, because there are obviously there's irrigators out there that were quite happy to utilise those tariffs. So some were happy about it, some were not. So I think at the end of the day, we just have to keep pushing for seasonal use tariffs that impact all users, not just some that are able to irrigate at night, because that's not something that all can do, unfortunately.
Can you describe what you'd see as an ideal seasonal use tariff and what that would look like in practice?
I think a tariff that's a low price tariff that isn't going to have any high demand charges because they're utilising it at a peak time. Unfortunately, I know how the grid works, and that's something that I'm not sure whether retailers would be able to fulfil, but I think a low price tariff that all irrigators can use regardless of what time of the day would suit. I think an agricultural specific tariff would be fantastic. And I'm hoping through the transition to renewables that will be identified in greater detail to see that it is something that's needed, and we can look at some kind of renewables there, isolated grids that can provide that energy to keep that viable and not impact the grid, which is obviously a concern for the major networks.
When you say agriculture specific, you mentioned just a cheaper anytime tariff. and less demand charges, are there any other components that an ideal tariff should have other than just cheap per kilowatt and less demand charges?
I think for the heavy users, those that are having to, they're blocked in at certain times. For example, ginning, there's no option to have it all the year. It's only specific times. I think a tariff that would enable them to keep those energy charges down, and agriculture specific would be cotton users. Obviously, that would identify their usage charges and help them minimise those costs. So yeah, when I'm thinking about if you're looking at heavy users, that would definitely help that part of the agricultural industry.
Is it something where an ideal tariff would be one that you have power for, say, 6 months of the year or 9 months of the year or something, and then you don't have power and you don't have supply charges for part of the year?
How do you regulate that across the whole agricultural sector? I just don't think that's possible, given you've got the horticulture industry, which obviously a large portion of them need fridges. You've got, again, cotton, you've got cane, you've got so many variables. You've got the nursery industry. You can't tie down a specific time of the year for an agricultural tariff specific just for that particular time, because it's not going to suit all users, unless, however, there is, again, a lower use tariff that anyone can use all time of the year, and that peak time, which potentially could help some of our cotton users reduce their costs. But again, I don't see how a certain period of the year could help the broad spectrum of our industry, because it's very hard to monitor that, and especially when it comes to irrigation, because again, if you've got dry seasons and you're still having to do other things on farm, then you can't pick and choose your months, unfortunately.
No. I mean that's what we found too. That across the board, you've got so many different load signatures from so many different sectors that I agree you definitely can't have just one agricultural tariff that would suit everyone, because everyone's operations are so different. But at the same time, I think what I'm trying to get at is to what extent is it simply an affordability issue that the price per kilowatt hour is too high, or is it something where without a change in the price, that the pricing can be better distributed onto different components, so like higher supply charges but lower demand charges, or like
lower demand charges obviously would be helpful for those industries that do have to do a higher end at certain peak times. I think that's definitely an option, but it's not something that would help all, unfortunately. I think going forward, and the state government already looking at it, is the impacts of climate change to energy use and water use on farm. And I mean, the energy use may seem like an odd one, but unfortunately it's not, because the pumping regimes, the energy use is all going to be, obviously, it will all change under climate change. We'll have possible changes in water allocations. You're going to have a higher level of evaporation of water. That's going to minimise what water that you have, and then obviously depending on what those pumping charges are, what the market is doing for energy pricing at that time can increase your costs on farm, especially in drier periods. If you don't have that rain, and obviously we're seeing it now with longer dry spells, that we're going to be more dependent on using irrigation in more of a permanent set because of the lack of rainfall. So therefore that will change your energy costs. So I think there will be a bit more of a transition to looking at other options of energy use on farm, and we're already seeing that with farmers that are already acknowledging the changes that they're seeing on farm for climate. There's farmers that are already experiencing the changes of season, that their flowers are flowering. So there's crops that are either flowering sooner than normal, so therefore they have to factor in that water component in a different time frame, a different time set, which may not be rainfall dependent, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of variables that are going to change as the climate changes, and especially with water policy and the possible integration of the different uses of groundwater and water allocations may be minimised. So therefore, that's going to impact the crops, that the crop yields and the expansion of farms and what's growing. So this is not just an energy issue. This is a holistic view that the agricultural sector are looking at. And it's good to see that the government are obviously catching up with that, but the farmers have been working with the changes in climate for quite some time, especially those, like I've already just stated, that have noticed that the crops are obviously ready for production in a lot earlier time frame than before, and then we've got longer periods of drought that will come in the next few years. You know, if we see another La Nina, we'll be fine. But again, these are factors that the energy sector and the water sector are already looking at, and so are farmers. Okay, so the changes in different energy policy or anything that's even coming up, we started our own strategy here approximately 18 months ago with Energy Queensland and Ergon, because I found that there was a displacement of education that wasn't meeting the end user, and everything was sort of getting, there was no clarity about the changes, and I found that I was answering a lot of questions that I couldn't give 100%, 100% verification on. So what QFF have undertaken is to work very closely with Energy Queensland and Ergon. We meet with them very regularly, and what we did establish about 16 months ago was an ongoing fact sheet. So if there was any regulatory changes that needed to be made, or any subsidies that were coming up that we needed to make our members aware of, we work with them to obviously work out the structure of what was happening. For example, the ETAS, we worked out what was happening, how we could write that up in a format that was easy to understand, and then we went back to our members and in the draft format got their feedback. They then helped put this draft together. It then went back to Energy Queensland, and then Energy Queensland got that obviously verified and ticked off to have that release. And that then went out with not just the bills, so that was everyone then got that. It also was distributed through our network, and our members then distributed to their members. So it's been a very successful communication piece that we've established, that I think, going forward with a lot of the changes will help any direct policy in it, and it clears up a lot of miscommunication that can happen without that clarity of what those changes mean. So that's been a really good education piece that's been established from the energy retailers, energy providers, right straight directly to the end user. So that the end user has obviously had impact in formulating those questions. So that's been a very good piece that's worked for all of our members.